75% of our crops grow because they're pollinated by bees. The plants provide food, shelter, and oxygen. So without the plants, we'd be in trouble, and without the bees, the plants would be in trouble. So in recent years, lots of people might have heard, oh, the bee is in danger, the extinction of the bee is coming, all the bees are threatened. It's actually, as often happens with these stories, a bit more complicated.
Hey, I'm Ikra, and this is What's in the World from the BBC World Service. What is your reaction when you see a bee? Do you run away? Do you stay calm? Try and swat it away? Well, it turns out that bees are in trouble. In Europe, over the last decade, the number of wild bee species at risk of extinction has more than doubled. And you might be thinking, why should I care? And the answer is because bees are important to all of us. Without them, our food systems would be seriously affected. And that's what we're going to be chatting about today. We're going to find out why bees are so important to us. Okay, so there's no better expert for this than Georgina Ranard, who's the BBC's climate and science reporter. She's on the line right now. Hey, Georgina.
Hey, Ikra.
And I hear we've got a little bit of a bee quiz to be doing, so I'm going to pick up the cards. I've got true and false right here, ready to go.
Okay, first one, only female bees sting.
Oh my gosh, I've never thought of this before. Only female bees sting. I'm going to say that's false.
No, it's true.
Ah!
Of course we sting.
I didn't know that before. That's such a great fact.
Okay, half of the most eaten crops globally depend on pollinators like bees.
I'm going to say true.
No, it's false.
Oh,
It's actually way more than that. So it's 75% of the crops that we all eat need pollinators. So third one, bees have 3 eyes.
I'm going to say that's false.
Yes, you got one.
Yeah.
They actually have 5. And then so obviously there's lots of different, in a hive, all the bees have different roles. And one of those is the worker bee, the kind of hardworking, they do the grunt work. So the average top speed of a worker bee is around 20 miles an hour or 28 kilometers an hour. True or false?
That was quite a detailed question there. So I'm going to say true.
It is true, which is crazy. These tiny little insects flying at 20 miles an hour. Okay, and then another one of this is the most important bee in the hive, the queen. In her busiest season, which is summer, the queen bee lays up to 1,000 eggs a day. True or false?
She is the queen, so I'm going to say that's true.
It is false. It's actually
no.
2,500 eggs a day.
Okay, so she's more of a queen than I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. The queen's amazing. You know, the queen bee is actually, she's in charge of the hive, and obviously in the hive they all have different roles. The worker bees, which is the male bees, their job is to clean the hive, and if they're not doing a good enough job, if they're a bit lazy, the queen bee and her entourage get him kicked out, so he's out of the hive and he has to survive on his own outside.
I'm taking that from the queen bee. I respect her even more now. Yeah. Georgina, thank you so much for that quiz to kick things off. I think I did okay there, but I've got some burning questions for you now. Why are bees so important to us?
As we talked about in the quiz, 75% of our crops grow because they're pollinated by bees, and also 80% of wildflowers are pollinated by bees and other insects. The plants provide food, shelter, and oxygen. So without the plants, we'd be in trouble, and without the bees, the plants would be in trouble. So I'm mostly talking about wild bees here and bumblebees. Honey bees are a bit different. Obviously, we use them in hives to produce honey. But where I live, for example, in the UK, carrots, apples, raspberries, tomatoes, they're just some of the crops that need pollinating by bees. And they don't do it on their own. There are thousands of other insects that help out, but they really are these amazing, tiny little creatures, and fascinating and super clever in how they organize their hives. So I love the bee. I really respect it.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk numbers then, because we've mentioned a little bit that populations are declining across the world. By how much?
So in recent years, lots of people might have heard, oh, the bee is in danger, the extinction of the bee is coming, all the bees are threatened. It's actually, as often happens with these stories, a bit more complicated. So firstly, there's lots of different types of bees. There's bumblebees, those big kind of furry ones. There's solitary bees, which are just out there. They don't form hives. and then honeybees, which produce honey. Some of them are doing well. So in parts of Asia, bee populations are actually quite stable. In China, honeybees are really thriving because there's a lot more demand for honey. And then some of those bee groups are crowding out the others. So there are signs that honeybees are threatening the populations of the wild bees. Um, and that is actually where the biggest problem are and the biggest decline is. So one study found that between 2006 and 2015, there were 25% fewer species of wild bees than there had been for most of the last century.
Yeah, so I guess we're getting a sense of the different parts of our life that bees are useful for. But when we're talking about their decline, what does that mean for us in terms of like the food system, the ecosystems that we rely on?
I mean, basically, if the global bee population and particularly wild bees were to collapse, we would be in really serious trouble. We wouldn't be able to pollinate our crops. It would have to be done manually. So farmers or maybe even robots in the future would have to be going around doing that pollination themselves, which would be really difficult, really expensive. So yeah, I keep saying this word like pollination. And this is a bit like going back to learning biology at school. But basically, to make more flowers and seeds, the female part of the flower has to be fertilized by the male part of the flower of the plant. But obviously, plants can't move really, so the pollen grains have to be transferred either by the wind sometimes or by insects, birds and bats. They carry the pollen when they fly between different plants, and this is really where the bee comes in because so they fly between the different plants to eat nectar and pollen. They're sort of enjoying themselves, having a feed inside the flower. But then they've got sticky legs, and so the pollen sticks on their legs, and then they transplant it between all the different plants and flowers. Different species of bees are matched really well to different plants, so they've evolved together basically. So even the shape of the plant is sort of has developed around the shape of the bee, and they have they're basically really fussy eaters, and they only really want their plant or their flower, and that's why it's really complicated. And pollination is actually really sensitive and difficult, and it's quite a tricky problem to solve.
Okay, so Georgina, let's pause for a second right there. We want to bring in Arna Bangra. He's an environmentalist and a beekeeper in Sierra Leone, and he's done a lot of work to save populations of bees.
For me, typically, beekeeping begins very early in the morning. I'm working on to see the hives, observe them, just listen to the sound of the bees, the work they are doing, where they are collecting their nectar. I mostly harvest honey, and then always take good care of the bees. Beekeeping is actually a rhythm of patience and care and also respect for not only the ecosystem but for the bees. So every day remind me that protecting the bees means that we are not only protecting the environment, but we are protecting the environment for our future. Over the past few years, I've engaged in training community members in enhancing sustainable beekeeping practice, but also revitalizing local bee population. Bees are not just there in terms of like producing honey, they are also key pollinators that ensures that crops and wild plants thrive. So without them, the food chain is at a big problem in enhancing food security, and also the ecosystem of itself would suffer. So that is why teaching community sustainable beekeeping practice is so important, because it doesn't only provide sustainable livelihood for rural community and their family, but also reduce the dependency on activities like logging, hunting, and poaching, and also it encourage also community to protect local forest and also rather than focusing on exploiting it.
And Georgina, back to you. When we're looking at populations of bees in Europe, why are they at such high risk now?
So last year, nearly 100 wild bee species in Europe were classified as threatened by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So they said more than 20% of species in groups like bumblebees and cellophane bees are facing a risk of extinction. And those bees are important. They threaten peas, beans, peanuts, clover, and trees, plants like daisies, this lovely plant that we really like in Europe. And it boils down, it's really three long-term trends that are threatening bees. And we see these trends threatening us as humans, but also many other animals and plants. And it's basically intensive agriculture, pollution, and rising temperatures linked to climate change. So intensive agriculture is creating habitat loss. So basically land that used to be it used to be quite diverse. It had lots of different trees, plants, some very old species. That land's being turned over to make big farms, obviously to grow food for us, which is good, but has consequences, or it's developed for housing, and that destroys these very diverse old landscapes, getting rid of the wide range of flowers. There's pollution, so that's partly just the pollution that humans create generally, but also fertilizers and nitrogen that's used in farmers. Obviously, that's to encourage extra growth, but it disturbs the environment and disturbs the plants that are growing there, meaning there's less food available for the bees. And then climate change is obviously a big one. So it's changing the seasons and where plants and trees can grow. You're basically just disrupting the natural world. So the way they've lived for thousands of years is changing very quickly, and they can't adapt to that. And all of that is putting these pressures on the bees, so they're struggling. These particularly wild bees are struggling to survive.
Okay, I'm learning how important, how powerful the bee is all throughout this chat, Georgina. But it's left me wondering, what are governments, what are people doing to protect the bees?
So I think what bees have got on their side is that they're very charismatic. And I think, in the last 20, 30 years, like the PR for the bee has really been quite successful. So in the UK, where I am, the government has passed some legislation to ban harmful pesticides, which can threaten the bee and kill off the plants that they feed on. And then globally, lots of countries have signed up to a pledge called 30 by 30. So that's where they've pledged to protect 30% of land in the world for nature by 2030, which is only a few years away, and I'm not sure we'll make those targets. But that includes protecting habitats for bees. Farmers can be paid. This is quite in parts of Europe and the US, so they can be paid to create wildlife-friendly areas. So even stuff like, if you think of a field where crops are grown, sometimes they're encouraged to create hedges around the edges, or retain or leave some fields wild, so that instead of planting there, and that creates nice environments for bees. But it's also a big focus for scientists. So last year I met some scientists at Oxford University in the UK who've developed a synthetic superfood for bees, and that would help give those honeybees extra food over winter if their food had run out.
And I guess if someone's listening and thinking, I really want to see if I can do something, I want, if I can, what would you say to them? Is there anything we can do on a personal level to help the bees?
I mean, I would say definitely no one should be scared of them, unless, some people do have an allergy, and obviously that's totally fine. So try not to be scared of them. But if you have any land or garden or any sort of green space where you live, you could make it a place where wild bees or bumblebees can thrive in. So the key is to try and find out what native plants are in your area. Lots of places now have these sort of invasive plants or non-native. They're not great because the bees who live where you live are native and they want to eat native plants that they've evolved to eat. So if you're in parts of the Mediterranean, it might be lavender. In West Africa, it could be eucalyptus or mango. In India, it could be coconut. So obviously, not everyone has green space or money to plant trees or plants, but if you did, that would really help, because then it just gives the bees basically a local food supply of food, and that will help them stay healthy and have enough food to eat over the winter, and hopefully grow those populations.
Georgina, I think we need a whole new episode about all the different types of bees. But for now, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so that's almost it from us for today. But before we leave, I wanted to shout out some of your comments you guys have been leaving. This one comes from our episode about how birth order could affect personality. It's from Merlion Down Under, who says, I do believe that birth order makes a big difference. I can usually tell if a person is the eldest or the youngest in the family based on how they behave. So thank you for that one. Remember, you guys can reach out to us at any time, comment below. But for now, I'm Ikra. This is What's in the World from the BBC World Service, and I'll see you soon. Bye.